Welcome. We are embarking on an extensive analysis of one of the most complex, chilling, and certainly lengthy criminal careers of the late 20th century.
Mhm.
We're looking at the life and the sheer breadth of crimes committed by Sante
A
Kimes.
fascinating and deeply disturbing figure.
Absolutely. She was a woman known by multiple aliases, frequently impersonated celebrities, and she leveraged every tool of manipulation possible, earning that chilling moniker, the Dragon Lady.
That name, while certainly evocative, it only begins to capture the scale of her operation. We are sifting through a substantial archive of sources today, and they detail a crime spree that was truly decades in the making.
Decades.
It incorporated almost every illegal activity you can imagine. We're talking massive financial fraud, serial arson, robbery. And then it gets even darker. Explicit convictions for slavery and, ultimately, multiple counts of calculated murder.
So our mission in this exploration is to really structure this wildly complicated history for you.
Exactly. We need to move beyond just listing the horrific acts and instead pinpoint her core criminal methodologies. Specifically, how her innate need for psychological control drove this gradual, horrifying descent into absolute violence.
It's the sheer volume and the diversity of her criminal activity that is just so astounding. Sante Kimes, born Sante Louis Singers in 1934, she essentially turned crime into her sole profession.
Right.
The core tension we extract from the sources is seeing how one individual could so successfully leverage charm, forgery, and just relentless intimidation to fleece people for years.
And create this path of destruction.
A path of destruction that culminated in the brutal deaths of several individuals who simply stood in the way of her schemes.
And this path didn't end quietly. It culminated with her arrest in 1998, along with her son, Kenneth Kimes Jr., for the disappearance and murder of the socialite Irene Silverman in New York City.
And when they went to trial, the evidence was so layered, so extensive, that the source material clearly documents their conviction on an almost unbelievable 118 charges.
It's an incredible number. When you hear that 118 convictions ranging across everything from grand larceny, illegal weapons possession, conspiracy, eavesdropping, and murder, it just speaks to a life entirely pathologically dedicated to criminal enterprise.
So to establish the subject clearly for everyone, Sante Kimes was an American multiple murderer, a con artist, and a slaver. Her criminal career was supported first throughout her marriage to Kenneth Kimes Sr., a millionaire, but the most violent acts were later, terrifyingly, executed in partnership with the one person she controlled most completely, her son, Kenneth Jr.
Yes, and the complexity of this narrative, it really requires us to go right back to her origins. The source materials offer these glimpses into her foundational psychology, which I think helps us understand how she later managed to maintain such absolute power over others.
Okay, let's unpack this history. We need to look at the foundations of the Dragon Lady, examining her early life, the psychological red flags that were apparent in childhood, and how her very particular brand of deceit, which involved fabricating reality, began to take shape.
Well, if we look at the documents regarding her identity, we see she was born in Oklahoma City in 1934 to Prama Mahendra Doc Singers, who was an herbalist, and Mary Gertrude Van Horn.
And the record immediately flags a core characteristic of Sante Kimes that would persist her entire life.
Fabrication.
Exactly, a compulsive, strategic liar about her own past.
Yes, she was building a fake foundation before her actual criminal career even started.
She would later claim that her father abandoned the family when she was 3 and that her mother had to turn to prostitution to survive. It's a classic, dramatic, and, a completely invented rags to riches story.
Or in her case, a rags to manipulator story.
Right.
But the reality, according to the records, is straightforward.
Right.
Her father died from heart disease when she was 5 years old.
5.
This early, consistent propensity for crafting these dramatic, misleading backstories, it shows us that manipulation and control were fundamental aspects of her personality. The truth was never sufficient. She needed a narrative that gave her importance and maybe justified her later actions.
And the stories from her childhood they're deeply disturbing. They strongly hint at the violence to come. Her younger sister, Retha, provided some truly chilling anecdotes that illustrate an early enjoyment of control through physical pain. There's mention of an incestuous relationship with her brother Carl, which speaks to a highly dysfunctional family structure, but the cruelty towards Retha is particularly telling.
It's the sheer sadism we have to note. Retha documented Sante holding lit matches underneath her fingers, against her will.
It's a deliberate act of physical intimidation and torture.
And what's also highlighted is the early evidence of deliberate cruelty towards animals. The sources detail her tying up goats and dogs on the family farm and using hat pins to mutilate and torture them.
That is extremely difficult to hear, but it is essential context.
Absolutely. These are massive psychological red flags. This is not just typical childhood mischief. It signals a profound lack of empathy, an enjoyment of seeing others suffer, and an absolute fixation on having dominance over a vulnerable subject.
And that fixation is the driving force behind the violence that came decades later.
That behavior pattern subjugation, it was already fixed by the time she moved to Los Angeles, allegedly adopted by Edwin and Mary Chambers. She graduated from Carson High School in Nevada in 1952.
And even there,
she was known simply as a bully who belittled and intimidated younger students. The pattern of subjugating others, whether they were animals, her sister, or her school peers, it was established early and only grew in complexity as she aged.
which brings us directly to the evolution of her adult criminal modus operandi, specifically how she weaponized financial instruments and destruction through arson.
She married Edward Walker, a general contractor, in 1957. They had one son, Kent Walker. It was during this marriage that we see the first documented crime that served as a blueprint for decades of financial schemes.
We're talking about the 1960 act of arson. Sante deliberately set fire to a house Walker had built.
Right. And it wasn't about destroying the property randomly. It was specifically designed to fraudulently collect insurance money.
She targeted only the kitchen and received US $10,000.
To contextualize that for you, that is equivalent to collecting over $106,000 in today's currency.
Wow, that's a highly successful payout for a partially burned kitchen.
This illustrates a key point. Arson wasn't a crime of passion or random destruction for her. It was a highly calibrated financial instrument.
And it became routine.
The source material notes that over the course of her marriage to Walker, dozens of houses he had supervised mysteriously burned down. Arson was her highly reliable foundation for generating cash.
After successfully using arson as a financial tool for years, Sante's ambition clearly grew. The sources indicate she actively sought a partner who could provide a much larger platform for her crimes. She met motel tycoon Kenneth Kimes Jr. in 1971, specifically after reading about his recent divorce, a calculated move to find a wealthy mark. They married in 1981.
And Kenneth Sr. was 17 years her senior and possessed an estimated net worth of approximately $20 million.
Which translates to about $118 million today.
So this marriage significantly ramped up her opportunities. She was no longer just burning houses for tens of thousands. She was moving into the realm of multi-million-dollar scams.
And their son, Kenneth Kimes Jr., was born in 1975, placing him right in the middle of this escalating criminal world from a very young age.
Her signature cons were always based on elaborate fraud, forgery, and theatrical impersonation. She spent her entire adult life fleecing people.
But what is truly indicative of her style is the sheer brazenness of her social cons.
Oh, absolutely. She frequently impersonated Elizabeth Taylor, whom she slightly resembled, and often introduced Kenneth Sr. as a high-ranking ambassador.
And that ploy was so effective, so audacious, that it gained the couple access to a White House reception during the Ford administration.
That's right. She used deception not just for money, but to gain access and status.
This shows that the motive extended beyond pure money. It was about the thrill of achieving something illicitly and inserting herself into high-status environments through pure fabrication. But here is where the story takes a disturbing turn beyond mere financial deceit.
Yes.
Illustrating that fundamental need for absolute dominance we saw in her childhood, we have to address the shocking reality of her slavery convictions.
This is a crucial point in analyzing her pathology. The sources make it clear. Sante Kimes committed acts of fraud and exploitation that were not financially necessary.
Like the enslavement of maids.
Exactly. When she could easily have afforded to pay them legally and fairly.
So the motive was not survival. It was entirely domination, which speaks to her psychological profile.
Her method of control was meticulous and deeply exploitative, targeting the most vulnerable. She specifically looked for young, often homeless, undocumented immigrants, offering them housing and employment.
And once they were dependent and isolated.
She kept them as virtual prisoners.
And the mechanism she used to enforce her control was horrific and highly effective.
She threatened to report them to immigration authorities if they did not obey her every order, including physical demands and theft.
So this threat created a situation of total psychological and physical control, leveraging the victim's desperation and precarious legal status.
It did. What's equally notable is the financial fallout these legal battles caused. Sante's pursuit of absolute control, which led to the slavery charges, ended up costing the family their enormous fortune.
They squandered years and millions of dollars.
Millions of his original $20 million fortune on lawyers' fees, defending themselves against these anti-slavery laws and the subsequent civil lawsuits. The obsession with control literally decimated their wealth.
And the legal system did finally catch up to her here. Sante was arrested in August 1985 and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for violating anti-slavery laws.
She was also successfully sued in civil court by the victims.
And Kenneth Sr.
He took a plea bargain and agreed to alcohol treatment, indicating that while perhaps less actively malicious, he was certainly aware of and complicit in the horror she inflicted within their own homes.
Sante was released in 1989. Kenneth Sr. died of a brain aneurysm in 1994. By the time he died, the Kimes family fortune had been significantly depleted by years of legal battles.
Yes, and this depletion meant that Sante's crimes in the mid-1990s became even more desperate and financially essential. And now she was relying almost exclusively on the full cooperation of her son, Kenneth Jr., as her accomplice.
Which leads us into the darkest chapter of her life, the descent into homicide.
We have two major cases here, Omar Holmgren and Syed Bilal Ahmed, that, while deeply suspected and later confessed to by Kenneth Jr., never resulted in charges against Sante herself.
And they demonstrate the geographical reach of their crime.
Extending from Hawaii to Costa Rica and the Bahamas, yes.
Let's start with Elmer Holmgren, a 50-year-old lawyer connected to one of her earlier financial schemes. The sources reveal that in September 1990, Sante hired Holmgren to burn down her Honolulu home.
Once again, it was arson for insurance money, but this time the motive was more specific.
She was trying to avoid a property lien.
Right. And for listeners who may not be familiar, a lien is essentially a legal claim against property that's used as security for a debt. Because of this legal claim, selling the Honolulu home legitimately would have been extremely expensive.
It would have cost her close to $900,000.
Which is over $2.17 million today. Arson was the faster, cheaper way out, bypassing the legal debt.
But as always seems to happen with Sante, the partner became a liability.
Insurance investigators interviewed Holmgren, who, under pressure, admitted his involvement in the attempted arson. This made him a witness who needed to be silenced before the authorities could definitively link Sante to the fraud.
Her initial reaction was pure destruction to eliminate evidence.
On October 24, she burned down Holmgren's office because he possessed incriminating legal documents related to the case. But that still wasn't enough to ensure silence.
Holmgren vanished shortly after. He told his family he was taking a trip to Costa Rica with the Kimeses on August 1991, and was never seen again.
And this is where Kenneth Jr.'s confession becomes the crucial source of information. In November 2000, he admitted that his mother told him she had killed Holmgren.
The alleged method Sante used was chilling in its brutality and intimacy.
Hitting him in the head with a hammer while she was riding in the back seat and he was in the front passenger seat of a car. The fact that this confession came years later and the victim's body was never found, it really highlights the difficulty in securing a murder conviction in this specific case.
Even with the details from Kenneth Jr.
Right. No charges were ultimately brought against Sante for Holmgren's death.
The second uncharged case is Syed Bilal Ahmed in the Bahamas in 1996. This victim was a 46-year-old banker who was in charge of Sante's offshore bank accounts in Nassau.
And given the depletion of the Kimes fortune, this murder appears motivated purely by the need to control or liquidate assets without the banker's cooperation or permission.
Kenneth Jr. confessed they acted together here as well.
They drugged Ahmed, drowned him in a bathtub in the Bahamas, and then dumped his body offshore on September 4th, 1996.
And Bahamian authorities suspected them at the time.
They did. But similar to the Holmgren case, a lack of direct physical evidence and the complexities of international jurisdiction meant no charges were ever filed.
Sante, consistent with her manipulative personality, staunchly denied any involvement in or knowledge of either of these homicides.
And her consistent defense, even years later, was that Kenneth Jr. only confessed to them solely to avoid the death penalty for himself and her later on, trying to paint him as the sole unreliable source.
This establishes a clear pattern. Suspected, often brutal violence, backed up by her son's testimony, but not yet legally proven.
Exactly. However, the financial pressure and the need to maintain their lifestyle drove them to commit the crimes that finally caught up to them, the two murders that resulted in definitive convictions. David Kasdan and Irene Silverman.
Okay, let's start with David Kasdan, age 63, in Los Angeles. The financial setup here was a classic example of Sante Kimes' deceit using prior relationships.
In the 1970s, Kasdan had allowed Sante to use his name on the deed of a Las Vegas home she and Kenneth Sr. actually occupied.
A seemingly minor favor decades earlier.
But it gave Sante the perfect tool for massive fraud in the late 1990s. With her fortune dwindling, Sante later forged Kasdan's signature on a loan application for $280,000, using the Las Vegas house as collateral.
And that loan amount is equivalent to over $500,000 today.
Specifically $540,000, yes.
Kasdan only discovered the forgery when he received a letter directly from the bank alerting him to this massive loan taken out against property bearing his name.
And when he immediately threatened to expose Sante, his fate was sealed. The motive for murder was, again, purely to silence a financial witness who held the key to her elaborate scheme and could dismantle the fraudulent loan.
And Sante, according to Kenneth Jr.'s later testimony,
ordered her son to kill him.
On March 9, 1998, Kenneth Jr. murdered Kasdan in his Los Angeles home by shooting him in the back of the head.
The source material details that the subsequent cleanup involved an accomplice, who later testified that all three participated in disposing of the evidence. Kasdan's body was found in a dumpster near LAX.
And their attempt to conceal evidence was thorough.
It was. The murder weapon was disassembled and dropped into a storm sewer.
The discovery of Kasdan's remains on March 14, 1998, officially launched the investigation that would lead directly to the Kimes family.
Detectives focused intensely on the fraudulent mortgage application, which led them to David McCarran, a homeless man who Sante and Kenneth Jr. had forced to stay in a partially burned house to help them collect insurance money.
Which links the Kasdan murder directly back to Sante's long-standing methodology of using arson and coercion.
Exactly. And the investigation quickly linked him to a second accomplice, Stan Patterson, who confessed to selling the handgun Kenneth Jr. used to kill Kasdan.
So faced with felony charges stemming from the mortgage fraud and the murder, Patterson reluctantly agreed to cooperate with police,
setting up the crucial sting operation that led to their arrest in New York months later.
And the reason they were in New York City was to execute what would become their most famous and devastating crime, the disappearance and murder of Irene Silverman.
Before we delve into the details of the crime, it is essential we acknowledge the victim.
Yes.
Irene Silverman was an 82-year-old former ballerina, model, and socialite. She was living peacefully in her own magnificent home when she was targeted.
The violence perpetrated against her purely for financial gain deserves our profound sympathy and acknowledgement. She was an elderly woman, entirely unaware of the sophisticated predator who had entered her life.
Silverman was last seen at her townhouse on East 65th Street on July 5, 1998. Kenneth Jr. had already established a presence there, moving into one of her rental apartments the previous month using an alias.
And the financial target was immense, highlighting Sante's high-stakes ambition in the late 90s.
The ultimate goal was for Sante to assume Silverman's identity and appropriate ownership of her mansion, which was valued at $7.7 million.
Which is equivalent to nearly $12.7 million in 2024. They were trying to steal a fortune in prime Manhattan real estate.
And they were prepared to execute the theft immediately. Authorities later found a forged deed transferring the mansion to Sante's shell corporation for only $395,000.
Let's just pause on that term, shell corporation. For listeners, Sante didn't just want the money. She wanted the legal appearance of a legitimate sale.
Right. A shell corporation is a company that exists only on paper, with no active business or assets. Sante used it to mask herself as the buyer, creating an arm's-length transaction that would, theoretically, make the property transfer look legitimate to a bank or a title company.
Even with the ridiculously low sale price listed on the forged deed.
Exactly. This layer of complexity shows the calculation of the Kimes' plans.
And the planning was meticulous and chillingly documented. When authorities arrested them on July 5, 1998, the very day Silverman vanished, they found disturbing evidence of their preparation.
This included 15 notebooks filled with Sante's detailed descriptions of mortgage fraud schemes involving many intended victims, including Silverman and Kasdan.
They had also recorded Silverman's phone conversations.
Just invasive surveillance meant to learn her routines and weaknesses?
Their arrest occurred at the New York Hilton. Initially, the charges stemmed from a separate $14,900 fraudulent check written in Utah, which was the excuse for the police to move in.
But the evidence found in Kenneth Jr.'s possession immediately connected them to the Silverman disappearance and confirmed the complex network of fraud they were running.
The list of seized items reads like a catalog of a professional criminal outfit.
It does. Silverman's house keys, the cassette tapes of her recorded calls, loaded firearms, wigs, masks intended for disguise, plastic handcuffs, $30,000 in cash.
An empty box for a stun gun, and a substance similar to a date rape drug. They were equipped for kidnapping, coercion, and complete identity takeover.
And, critically, they found that forged deed intended to transfer ownership of Silverman's multi-million-dollar mansion to Sante's shell corporation. The evidence was overwhelming, and it proved intent and motive, even without a body to prove the murder.
The actual details of the murder came out much later, during the Kasdan trial.
Yes, Kenneth Jr. confessed that his mother first used a stun gun on Silverman to subdue her, after which he strangled her. He then stuffed her corpse into a bag and deposited it in a dumpster in Hoboken, New Jersey.
And this became one of the most famous murder convictions achieved in New York history without the recovery of the victim's body.
The sheer volume of circumstantial evidence, the planning notebooks, the victim's keys, the forgery materials, the weapons found on the day of the disappearance, and the forged deed, it strongly suggests they were caught right at the peak of their operation, perhaps mere hours after the homicide, before they could successfully transfer the mansion.
The New York Silverman trial, which took place in 2000, was a landmark case precisely because no body was recovered.
Yet the evidence recovered from their car supported the prosecution's narrative, establishing context not just for the Silverman murder, but also providing crucial background for the later Kasdan prosecution in California.
The prosecution focused on motive and planning. They successfully argued that the only reason a person would possess an elderly woman's keys, a forged deed to her property, and detailed notes on how to kill and dispose of a body was because they had already committed the murder.
The strength of the circumstantial evidence against both Sante and Kenneth Jr. was just undeniable.
The jury agreed, voting unanimously on their first poll to convict both Sante and Kenneth Jr. of murder, plus those 117 other charges, including robbery, conspiracy, forgery, and eavesdropping.
Sante's behavior during the trial itself was erratic and symptomatic of her narcissism. She chose not to take the stand in her own defense.
And this decision came only after the judge ruled that prosecutors would be allowed to question her about her extensive criminal history.
Specifically, her previous convictions, including the time she served for slavery. She clearly feared the jury hearing the full extent of her criminal past, especially the slavery charges, which would cement her image as a sociopathic manipulator.
And her attempts to manipulate the process continued outside the witness box. The judge was forced to take the highly unusual step of ordering Sante not to speak to the media.
This occurred after she passed a note to a New York Times reporter in court, attempting to influence the narrative.
The judge responded decisively,
explicitly threatening to handcuff her during future court appearances if she persisted, and restricting her telephone access only to her lawyers. This was a direct judicial acknowledgement that Sante Kimes was not merely a defendant, but an active, ongoing threat to the integrity of the judicial process.
She was unable to start manipulating her environment.
Right.
When it came time for sentencing, Sante used the opportunity for one final, dramatic, theatrical performance. She delivered a prolonged, rambling statement, blaming the authorities and her own lawyers for framing her and her son.
She reached for historical parallels, comparing their trial to the Salem witch trials, and accusing the prosecutors of murdering the Constitution.
The judge's response was definitive and cutting, reflecting the extensive documentation of Sante's pathology presented during the trial. After ordering her to be silent, he publicly called Sante a sociopath and a degenerate.
He labeled Kenneth Jr. a remorseless predator, who was nonetheless a dupe of his mother.
And they received maximum sentences, 120 years for Sante and 124 years for Kenneth Jr., amounting to effective life imprisonment for both.
But their legal troubles weren't over, as they still faced the death penalty in California for the murder of David Kasdan.
This looming threat led directly to a dramatic and desperate incident in October 2000, while Kenneth Jr. was imprisoned awaiting extradition.
Yes, the shocking prison hostage situation. While conducting a prison interview, Kenneth Jr. held Court TV reporter Maria Zone hostage for 4 hours.
And he was pressing a ballpoint pen, a horrifyingly mundane weapon, to her throat.
His singular desperate demand was that his mother not be extradited to California, where she faced the death penalty. This act, committed while facing a life sentence, speaks volumes about the complete psychological control Sante maintained over her adult son.
He risked further punishment, even death, solely to protect his mother.
Thankfully, negotiators managed to create a diversion, allowing Zone to break free when Kenneth Jr. momentarily removed the pen from her throat, and he was quickly apprehended.
Despite the delay caused by this incident, both were eventually extradited. Kenneth Jr. in March 2001 and Sante followed in June 2001 to face trial for the Kasdan murder.
And the key turning point in the entire saga occurred during that California trial in June 2004. Kenneth Jr. changed his plea to guilty in the Kasdan case.
This plea deal was the ultimate unraveling of Sante's empire.
In exchange for Kenneth Jr. avoiding the death penalty and ensuring his mother wouldn't face it either, he testified against Sante. He completely turned on her, exposing every hidden detail of their multiple crimes, meticulously describing how he had indoctrinated him and used him as her accomplice.
And confirming the details of the uncharged murders as well.
Yes, the power of this testimony, coming from her own son, was immense. Sante, predictably, reacted with the same dramatic denial she had used in New York.
She delivered yet another prolonged statement denying the Kasdan murder, claiming he was her best friend, and accusing the police and her son of massive misconduct and framing her. She was again eventually ordered by the judge to be silent.
The judicial judgment in the Kasdan case was equally severe and pointed, reflecting the deep impression Sante's pathological behavior made on the court. The presiding judge called Sante one of the most evil individuals she had encountered in her time on the bench,
underscoring the severity of her psychological manipulation and her total lack of remorse, even when facing incontrovertible evidence and the testimony of her own child.
Sante was convicted again.
Following the second conviction, Sante was returned to New York State to continue serving her original massive sentence. She died at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women on May 19, 2014, at age 79, still maintaining her innocence.
And Kenneth Jr. is currently serving his decades-long sentence at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in California, forever linked to the intricate and violent criminal enterprise she created, and the one he ultimately helped dismantle.
This analysis of the source material detailing Sante Kimes' criminal life gives us a stark view of a truly serial criminal whose methods evolved from low-level fraud into calculated murder driven by a relentless need for financial gain and, more importantly, total control.
Right.
Let's review the critical knowledge points we've covered.
The chronology is essential to understanding the evolution of her pathology. We first saw her criminal foundation built on decades of relentless arson and financial fraud, showing her ability to monetize destruction.
This was followed by the highly unusual and disturbing conviction for slavery, demonstrating that her innate need for total control superseded simple financial necessity.
And that foundation of deceit and control eventually transitioned into serial murder. The highly suspected killings of Elmer Holmgren and Syed Bilal Ahmed, which were difficult to prosecute internationally, before culminating in the confirmed charged murders of David Kasdan and Irene Silverman.
And central to finally confirming the facts of these incredibly complex crimes was the crucial role of Kenneth Jr.'s eventual testimony,
which he exchanged for avoiding the death penalty. His testimony provided the final necessary details that tied Sante directly to the homicides and the psychological abuse that fueled them, allowing the courts to successfully prosecute even in the absence of a body, as in the Silverman case.
We must reiterate the legal magnitude of this case, 118 charges, and the effectiveness of the prosecution, which managed to secure a murder conviction for Irene Silverman even without recovering her body.
The evidence of detailed planning, forgery, and the sophisticated attempt to steal the multi-million-dollar mansion was comprehensive enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, establishing a precedent for future no-body murder cases.
This entire saga, which has also been adapted into various media, illustrates a master manipulator who utilized everything, from legal loopholes and show corporations to her own son and the vulnerabilities of her victims as weapons to exert dominance over the world around her. This leaves us with a final reflective idea for you to consider, based entirely on the source material we've examined today.
The documents consistently detail Sante Kimes' relentless practice of maintaining total control over every person who entered her orbit, from young, vulnerable immigrant slaves who faced the threat of deportation,
to her elderly victims like Irene Silverman, whom she sought to erase entirely, right down to her own son, Kenneth Jr., who carried out her violent commands even when facing the electric chair.
If you look at the entire scope of her criminality, the financial gains were often secondary to the psychological power she exerted and the destruction she enjoyed causing.
Consider the true devastating power dynamics and the profound, decades-long psychological impact of a crime spree centered entirely on the subjugation, exploitation, and ultimately the violent disposal of anyone who threatened that ultimate pathological control.
That level of pathological domination is perhaps the most frightening and defining characteristic of Sante Kimes' legacy. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth analysis.
Thanks for listening.